Digitaler Espresso. Der Wachmacher-Podcast zu Kirche und digitalem Wandel.
Hello and welcome to our first Digital Espresso in English. My name is André Schröder.
And I am Andreas Menne.
In today's episode, we will be talking about religion in the digital age, religious online communication, and maybe a little bit about humor and internet memes.
Some might say religion and the internet, that's not really a match made in heaven. Others might argue that religious groups, practices, and discussions should be part of our digital lives in the same way as other cultural phenomena.
To make sure that we can talk profoundly about this topic, we have a special guest today. Heidi Campbell is a professor of communications at Texas A&M University. She started to research the intersection of technology and religion in the early years of the internet back in 1995. Now, nearly 30 years later, we would like to ask her what has changed since then and what hasn't. Heidi, thanks for being on our show.
Thank you so much for having me.
You might not know there's a little tradition on our show that requires full honesty. We always start with a be honest question. So Heidi, be honest. You have searched on the internet for 30 years now. How much religion did you actually find?
A lot, and actually growing more each day. I think as people have migrated online since the mid-1990s, they bring their passions with them. And especially post the pandemic, many churches were resistant before the pandemic, but when they found that the only option they would have is communicating online, it really increased the number of services and churches experimenting. And so I think now there's a lot of people that have gotten over the hump about the digital and the church being kind of two polar points, and maybe even working against each other to see that they can actually go together hand in hand.
That's nice to hear. Why I actually asked is that for some people, religion seems like an ancient cultural technique and the internet is a relatively new phenomenon. So what do you say? How do the two come together?
Well, overall, I found in my research, I study not just Christianity, but Judaism and Islam and how different groups intersect and use media technologies. And we can see even as far back as the printing press, religious communities have always adopted new technologies. While sometimes people on the outside will say, oh, well, religion is conservative, so it must be anti-modernity, so anti-technology. But any tool that will allow a religious community to get its message out, to interact with people, to help them shape their identity in that culture, has always been engaged, at least with some religious groups. And so I think, even if we look back in history, there's these interesting moments where, the church discovered the printing press, they discovered the radio, they discovered television. And we've seen, while there's often debates about how it should be used or what should be the boundaries of that use, religious groups and the church have always kind of seen the benefits of technology.
Can you name some modern examples of the religious use of modern technology?
Well, obviously, the internet, when it came about in the mid-1990s, religious groups kind of began to see, well, first it was people who were like digital programmers, software engineers that began to try to bring their own religion online. And so they often started either a website or an email community to gather people from their own faith community together. And so then when religious groups would say, oh, hey, there's a website on, Judaism online, or there's a website on the Catholic Church, maybe we should actually be officially representing ourselves rather than just like individuals. And so this drew many different religious denominations to kind of develop kind of these spaces, not just to share their stories, but also to get people from their community to communicate with one another.
From your point of view, which religious groups are especially successful in creating an online community, in doing community work, in having online services, online worshiping?
I think it's quite varied, because obviously there's some groups, like evangelicals who are very committed to kind of proselytizing and evangelism. So whether it's, evangelicals or even like the Lubavitch Jews who are really about proselytizing to secular Jews to bring them in. Whatever your kind of religious, the values of your religious community are, those seem to be what people do online. So, there's easy, if you're looking, I'm trying to engage or re-engage with my faith, those are good. Those groups are doing well. I think as far as an institution, the Catholic Church has been the best as one denomination of at least trying to offer different options, both in guidance to people of advice how to use digital media, and as well as encouraging things like bloggers about how, if you're going to, use these spaces to talk about our faith in the church, here's some guidelines and here's some provisions. And then other groups that are kind of like, I think, so a lot of charismatic Pentecostal groups have been really early adopters and kind of seeing like, hey, doing prayer online is really the same as like doing it face to face. We believe that God is everywhere, so he can be on the computer. And so for many of those groups, the idea of kind of a prayer group online was a lot less threatening than it has been for other groups. So again, whatever religious community, what their values are, seem to be the kind of primary ways, at least they first immigrate online. And again, and oftentimes the creative things that they imagine, the effort they put in those areas.
So you told us why it's useful and practical for the communities, but what fascinates you about digital religion? Why do you research on it?
I'm really interested in not necessarily technology originally, but I was interested in themes like community, like how do you form community? What does that really look like? And questions of religious authority, like what are the things that kind of affirm religious leaders and maybe challenge religious leaders? And, when the internet emerged in the early 1990s, I was actually studying overseas in Edinburgh, Scotland. And so for me, the ability to kind of connect with friends and family, overseas was a great resource. And so I began to see, hey, if people are doing this for social reasons, are they doing it for spiritual or religious reasons as well? So I began to kind of explore, on the early days of bulletin boards and news groups, how people were talking about these themes and how they were using them to pray and to study scripture and connect with one another. And I found that, a lot of my questions about what community looks like, they were trying to rediscover what that would look like in these digital spaces. And so I went with kind of basic questions, but it was the technological realm of the internet that just birthed a lot of interesting examples and kind of answers to those questions.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your work? How does online research work? Are there special methods for studying religious activities on the internet?
Well, I think, in the early days of kind of internet research, circa the 1990s, 2000s, researchers like myself were just kind of importing traditional research methods, like thinking about, well, how do I do an interview online? Thinking about what early technologies and recording platforms are out there and trying to do that. If we do a survey online, what kind of ways is a digital survey different or similar? And so thinking about how do you kind of translate traditional methods. And I think especially for a lot of scholars studying religion, ethnography was the most popular and still is the most popular method.
So what is ethnography?
Ethnography comes from anthropology. It's the idea of going into this new territory and trying to understand what's going on by being a participant observer, watching what's happening. And, a lot of early studies were going into Facebook groups or going into, an email format and just seeing how people form community. And over the last 10, 15 years, then the digital tools have become advanced. So people began to see, hey, we can do different kinds of research than we could before. A lot of the research, especially in big data, we can use anything from apps to different programs to kind of what we call scrape data from I can send a little bot out into, certain platforms, like a social media platform, say, I want you to gather all the quotes that have been said on this topic during this time period with groups I'm a member of. And so, again, there's no way you could gather that kind of practically or even just physically deal with that amount of data. And so digital allows you to ask some interesting questions in ways that you couldn't before. But also there's not just what you can do, but also the ethical implications, because sometimes people, the internet is kind of seen as a place for kind of entertainment and relationship building. And so they may not realize, hey, when I'm sharing information about myself, that actually is digitally traceable. And so that's a challenge that, researchers have of not just what access they can get at, what information they can get access to, but how do you talk to the people you're researching and maybe kind of inform them about, hey, you may not want to say that when you're in an interview with me, or this is what I'm going to do with my data. Do you feel comfortable with that? Because this data may exist much longer than you're around, or much longer than you have an opinion that you're sharing right now.
In your research on religious groups, did you encounter major differences between online and offline communities?
Well, I think, the early kind of adopters of the internet that especially came out of religious communities, these were people that either had access because of their jobs or technologies. So they were much more comfortable with that medium. And so kind of bringing their religion and trying to learn how to maybe use digital media to pray in a virtual environment, that didn't seem so uncomfortable. But I think a lot of people who, what we call digital immigrants, that, they learned how to write letters before they learned to type email. They learned how to, build friendships at a cafe rather than on a social media platform. They have found that kind of that going into the digital space a little bit more uncomfortable. And so, different groups have responded in very different ways. But as I said before, the pandemic has been not the great equalizer, but it definitely has kind of it was the forced digital experiment of the church. And I think it's allowed people to kind of think about what you can do well online and maybe what the limits of doing, religious practice or just religious community online can be.
What would you say? What are the limits, or what did people realize that limits them when they do religion online?
Well, in my PhD work, in my very first book, which is called We Are One in the Network, I was studying online email-based communities in the 1990s using the internet. And one of them came up with this great quote, and I called it the chocolate chip cookie factor. I guess you could call it the speculatus, or, another, maybe a factor. But the idea is that, if someone's really hurting or you really want to connect with them, you can't email them a plate of chocolate chip cookies. Obviously, you could get online and send them to them, but it's not the same as that face-to-face interaction. So for many people, and I think especially digital immigrants, there's going to be something that's always not complete about the digital experience, that the whole sense of that community for most digital immigrants is face-to-face. And so the internet kind of basically is seen as a supplement, but not a substitute. But it's really interesting with especially Generation Z and millennials, young people that, I teach at my university, they grew up in a world where they've never known anything but the internet. And so they're what we call digital natives, and they see the internet very differently. Like, the idea is like, oh, I actually met my first boyfriend or girlfriend online, and we actually communicated, via social media or, a Twitch platform or Instagram before we actually met face to face. And so I think we're seeing this kind of interesting change in culture, and probably as well as in the church, about the level of comfort or the level of expectation of, should religion be mostly online or offline or some combination? And I think for young people, the idea of living there out their faith, they don't distinguish between online and offline. It's just living out their faith. Whereas, Generation Xers, older folks like me, do see that clear distinction.
So many young people don't feel the need to have a face-to-face interaction. They experience the personal connection online as well. You already talked about the pandemic. Do you think the pandemic and the more or less forced digitization of religion is something that will have a lasting effect?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think with especially, young people, they will, when I'd survey my classes, like, they would never go to whether it's a specific church or another religious worshiping space until they'd actually visited their website and, visited a virtual service, And so for them, if a church or a religious group does not have a website, it's like not having a sign outside your building. It's like not having a front door. And so I think, for a lot of people, it's the expectation that, wow, if they want to connect with people, it's not just, it's a special extra tool. It's like, it's a must have. So just like, a website, have streaming your services. I think, it showed kind of people, it created a sense of expectation that would be there. And young people, I think, again, if they don't see you engage with digital, they think you're basically invisible, even if you are a bright and lively community. So there's an expectation that you do have online and offline presence, and they're coming together in your work.
So presence, offline or online, is key for religions. What would you say are the most important platforms to be on right now? And in which way do they differ when it comes to communicating religion online?
Well, in my research, I kind of studied two things. One is studying how religious groups use technology and how they respond to it. So I'm just finishing a big project over the last 3 years where we've been kind of walking with 2,700 congregations in the U.S. and how they, again, what decisions they made about technology, what they did during the pandemic, and what they're still doing now post-pandemic. So kind of looking at kind of, how that's changed their attitude just about what community and churches as well as just practical choices they're making. But I also like to study some of the non-traditional, not just how religious groups, but where religion shows up online in unexpected places. So one of the things I like to do is I like to follow Instagram accounts. And there's a lot of, these kind of digital influencers are emerging, whether they're people who they gather quotes and they put them on pretty backgrounds and their Instagram accounts are these nice inspirational things, or some of them are really kind of theological and trying to critique maybe things about culture. But there's a lot of interesting conversations that happen and in very colorful and creative ways on Instagram. And I also, I have a big research project where I'm studying how religion gets defined and shaped through memes. And, sometimes it's obviously people trying to put a message about their faith community outline, but other times it's just how people in popular culture see religion. And that's really kind of telling about, what kind of beliefs that people kind of associate with different religious groups and what kind of identities by just looking at the popular internet memes that use kind of religious characters or narratives.
For the people that are not very avid about the internet, maybe you can tell us a little bit what a meme is.
Okay, well, a meme, it's actually an idea that was coined by someone who worked in philosophy and biology. So a meme is like some kind of idea that can be easily communicated and replicated and shared with many people. So it's kind of like the idea of a virus. A virus, it replicates, it comes to another person, and then it changes a little bit, but it gets passed around. Internet memes, they can be an image, they can be a video, they can be even like a kind of a movie poster that's been recreated using digital media. But there's some kind of image element and some kind of textual element, and they use humor to communicate, things especially like iron or satire. And a lot of times they're kind of telling a joke. Sometimes it's for an inside group of people, and other times it's for a popular, broader audience. But there's a lot of characters that have been developed over time, some popular ones. One is called Success Kid. We see a little picture of a little kid, and he's got a little kind of yes, I did it. And it's a picture, of him. Actually, the real picture is him. He's actually eating a bunch of sand at the beach, but it's just been taken and created. But that kind of narrative, oh yeah, I'm proud of myself in some way, is used to talk about a lot of things, including religion, won the Sunday school, a Bible drill, score for me or things like that. But so they can be very playful and very, things to laugh at ourselves about the, things of our community. But they can also be very serious and very critical of religion as well. So they're kind of a double-edged sword in many ways.
For some people, humor is about mocking others, right? So there's always this double function. What would you say? Why is religion such a sensitive topic for many people?
Well, I think, obviously, we take our faith really seriously. And so when somebody else either belittles it or doesn't take it as seriously or kind of misinterprets it, it can be very hurtful and misunderstanding. Of course, it's kind of unrealistic for us to expect, if I'm from this particular community and you're not, or you have had no interaction with it, I can't expect you to understand why we do the certain practices we do or why these are core beliefs and how we interpret them. And sometimes we use a lot of religious language that kind of doesn't translate well. But it's interesting, some religious communities, such as Judaism, there's this real tradition of kind of making fun of themselves and the things that we do or things. And so, a lot of Jewish memes, they seem very self-deprecating, but they're actually are seen as very humorous by people in the community. And that same kind of humor, if for the Catholic or Protestant tradition, doesn't translate well. And so it's kind of learning out what there's just like every culture, like German culture and American culture have two different styles of humor.
Yeah.
So do religious groups. It's kind of seeing about how that translates and realizing, just because it works in my culture doesn't mean it's going to work well in yours.
Let's say people want to start creating their own memes. Do you maybe have some tips for them? Doing your first religious meme, what would you consider a good way to go?
Well, I actually have my students create memes all the time because what memes are, it's simple picture and simple like a simple slogan but communicates a lot of layers of meaning. So the first thing I would encourage them to do, there's a SEAM website that's called knowyourmeme.com. And you can go on that and basically learn a lot of these kind of what they call a meme macro. It's the different characters that are out there. And it'll give them a little story about who this character is, when they were first used, and the kind of ways that they're normally used. Like, are they criticizing things? Are they praising? And so by knowing those characters, then which characters might be more conducive to share especially if it's a positive message about religion than others. Because if you pick the wrong character, you may think you're saying one thing, but you're actually saying another. So I think knowing the characters, finding a little bit about them, and then just Google meme generator, and there's dozens of meme generators that basically it allows you to pick a picture, type a few sentences, and in less than a minute, you can create a meme. And those can be fun for, again, getting people's attention as well as kind of promoting things about different people's faith. There's a lot of Facebook groups and Instagram groups where people share these memes that kind of affirm, whether their religious identity or the beliefs of their community. And they can be very positive for kind of, people connecting with young people and kind of telling the true story about what different beliefs and different practices mean.
In your talks, you speak about memes and religious stereotypes. In which contexts are they used and which problems do they cause?
Yeah. So one of the things, the internet is, has been framed as this new innovative technology where it can do all these things. But what we often find is that people rely on the same patterns and practices and replicate them online. So both the positive things about what people find important as well as the things that people, maybe the wrong ideas they have. And so, whether it's kind of stereotypes about different races or genders or even religious groups, most of them, the popular stereotypes or negative stereotypes that are talked about, online and have been present in Europe and the US for, 100 years are still found online. For example, I remember there's one group of memes that kind of provide negative stereotypes about especially Judaism and Jewish religion. And I remember being in Wittenberg in Germany and going into the Martin Luther his home and library in Wittenberg and seeing some of these images of that people had kind of drawn during his time period of Jews, with this elongated nose with kind of these stereotypical figures. And it looked almost exactly like this one meme called the Angry Jew meme. And it's like, so that image has kind of been, a stereotype to communicate negative things about Judaism. That image is still being recycled online to actually kind of, again, criticize and to kind of belittle that faith community. So, unfortunately, we're not seeing, we see some new things, but, we can say there is, to some extent, nothing new under the sun. It's just recycled, upcycled, and remixed in digital form.
In Germany, we recently had a major study on online hate, and I think it said that over 80% of the population encountered hate online so far. And you're also engaged in a Create Kindness initiative. Do you have any ideas? How could our online communication become more humane and considerate?
Well, one thing I like to do in my classes is to kind of get people to kind of create memes, whether it's about their religious tradition to explain things to people, or just to kind of, how can you use memes to kind of get either affirm your community or just affirm people in general? Especially in North America, it seems over the last decade that not just being critical, but just being plain mean has been seen as acceptable in public discourse. That instead of just kind of engaging in a conversation, that people's first protocol is to attack somebody if they don't agree with what they do. And, obviously, as a communication studies professor, just on a basic level, to come on the attack is not a great way to build discourse of, understanding between people. And so showing that, just the same things that can be used to enhance or promote stereotypes can also be remixed to spread positive messages. And, so, I'm a big advocate of anything you can do to spread, kindness of, understanding of tolerance online is always a good thing. So use the creativity of the internet to do that rather than just share what the negative stereotypes that kind of, again, spread so much hate and distrust.
I'd like to come back to the question of authorities online. On the one hand, we have people with a lot of followers who don't have any religious authority. On the other hand, there are religious leaders who basically do not exist on the internet. Do you see some kind of clash here?
Yeah, as I was mentioning earlier, that the first people that were talking about religion or creating websites about religion, they weren't religious leaders or heads of denominations. They were just individuals. And so obviously, depending on their own personal opinion, whether that story, that religion or community got a positive story or a negative story told. So because of that, we've seen that people, you don't have to be a pope or a well-known pastor to get an audience about your religious beliefs online. And so for many people, they assume that the internet undermines religion, especially religious communities and religious organizations. But over the last, decade and a half, and I think post the pandemic, a lot of religious leaders and groups have gotten more digitally savvy, and they realize, hey, if we're not online telling our story, somebody else will be. And so we've seen a lot of religious leaders getting in, whether it's, webcasts, their worship services, podcasts like this, but trying to show a different side and engage, especially in a very personal way with people through digital media. I think that's enhanced. And so these same tools that kind of can undermine religious leaders can also be used by religious leaders to enhance and build trust in community. So, when people say, is the internet challenging religious authority or enhancing religious authority, I always say yes, it's doing both. And it just depends on which side you want to invest in.
Do you see some forms of partnership between those two? The partnership between the religious leaders on the one hand and the people that are very
good creators of religious content.
Or they have a broad audience on the internet.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of groups, I know some within the Muslim community. I know of a couple people, again, created websites, and it was first just to show people where can you buy halal food or halal products in our area. And then that person going to people in their community saying, hey, how can I help share the news about when your services are? And I think especially during the pandemic, we saw a lot of people kind of giving their time and resources that had digital expertise to helping churches get online, learn how to do, Zoom or YouTube, set up YouTube channels for their services. And so I think that there is a lot, and that's helped break down a lot of the kind of maybe some of the fear and boundaries that other religious groups had about the internet, seeing that, hey, that it's not just us against them. Actually, if we partner together, we can both be stronger.
Maybe some of our listeners might do some digital religion research on their own now. Can you give us, some hints or names of individuals or groups that do a good job on communicating religion online?
Yeah, just go into any Google or Bing search engine, and there's lots of examples of it. I think one of the best places is you go into a place like Facebook, and you'll find both Facebook groups that are focused on a specific church or, temple, as well as kind of just conversations, people who are all interested in process theology or Old Testament theology. And so there's lots of places where you can just join in and kind of just learn what's happening, and then decide if you want to contribute or not. But again, the internet has allowed people to again peek in the back door or the front door in ways that we couldn't before if you're just curious about a certain religious conversation or topic. While we're still, digital religion studies is a young field. It's been going for about 20 years. So there is a lot of articles and scholarship. I would just encourage someone to say, go to Google Scholar, the website, and then just put in, the Catholic Church and internet, or kind of, I want to learn about Seventh-day Adventists and the internet. And you can find articles, and a lot of them, increasing more and more, are kind of open access or at least linked in places so that you don't even have to have the scholarly credentials to go to a research library to get them. So I think there's a lot of easy ways out there to kind of learn about, and, scholars like myself, Mia Louvheim, Ruth Tazaria, Stuart Hoover, Nabila Taibi, Greg Grieve. We've all been working for 20 years or more in this area. So there's a lot of good books out there on the topic.
Let's say you have a time machine and you could go back in time to the early years of internet faith. Which advice would you give religious communities for their online activities?
Well, the one thing is it was a lot easier to do research in the 1990s, even though there weren't as many tools to do. But I think because the internet was so new and people thought, oh, if you have a faith and you go online to talk to other people of faith, they're going to be honest and trustworthy. And in most cases, I found that they were. But, I think there's been a lot of increased mistrust because people have taken advantage of that, from stealing data to, not being honest about that. So one thing I would say for early internet scholars or people doing that work, I wish, think about the implications of how you treat people, how you treat their data, and how you engage with them. That maybe if there had been a little bit more honesty or concern with some of the research as well as people, how they treated the people on the other people's screen, it wouldn't be as challenging today sometimes to kind of get in, have access to, or do the research that we want to do.
And if you could go back to the times of the COVID pandemic?
I think if I could say something to especially churches or religious communities at the beginning of the pandemic, the first thing I would say is I know maybe the internet is something you haven't thought about and it seems scary, but just do it. I think, a lot of groups spent, days, weeks, months, debating whether or not they should do it. And rather than just trying to experiment and then, decide and go, okay, we're going to do what works and what doesn't work. I think the other thing is also digital culture is a beta culture. It's all about, okay, I'm going to create a meme and put it out there and see, does it catch people's attention? And churches don't or religious groups, they don't want to do something that they might get wrong. And so as a real kind of fear, what if the web link breaks down, or what if, this person forgets what they're going to say, or the camera angle is really bad. And just realize that you're going to get it wrong. And that's what digital culture is about. It's about trying and refining rather than getting the perfect thing and then putting it out there. And I think, again, a lot of people, because of that fear or because of their wanting to get it perfect, they kind of got in the way of actually maybe being creative in what they could have done during the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Heidi, for having this conversation with us. It was a real pleasure.
Der digitale Espresso ist ein Podcast des Katholisch-Sozialen Instituts in Siegburg. Aufnahme und Ton: Markus Sager. Schnitt: Said Suma. Moderation: André Schröder und Andreas Menne. Musik: René Gefor-Karagi. Unser besonderer Dank gilt allen Interviewpartnerinnen und Interviewpartnern. Alle Infos zum Podcast finden Sie auf www.digitaleespresso.de.